Hello, everybody. I guess this is going to be the new system. In case you haven't heard, How to Write Romantasy is available for pre-order right now, and you have the option to receive a free digital workbook that will help you craft a power couple, throuple, or polycule. All the details are in the description. Get on it. On to today's topic. I am so excited to have Savannah Gilbo on the channel today to discuss some of the most common mistakes writers make when writing their first draft. Savannah Gilbo is an online writing educator and host of the top-ranked Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast with over 3 million downloads. She helps aspiring fiction authors confidently write, edit, and publish stories readers love. With a global community of over 100,000 writers and over 800 graduates from her signature program, Notes to Novel, Savannah empowers authors to overcome self-doubt, take creative risks, and bring their stories to life. Savannah is here to talk about the dreaded first draft, namely the mistakes so many writers make during that phase of the writing process. If you're writing your first draft, or if you've written it and you're about to embark on the editing phase, you gotta listen in. And there may or may not be a free little goodie available at the end of this video. Hello, Savannah. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Jenna. Thanks for having me.
Before we hopped onto the channel, you created a list of the most common mistakes you see in first drafts, and we're going to break them down one by one, covering why they're a mistake and how to avoid or fix them. Are you ready?
I am so ready. And just a spoiler alert, it was really hard to pick 5. We could go on and on all day about this, and maybe we'll do a part 2 someday if this is a popular episode, but we're going to go over 5 today.
That would be awesome because, yeah, there's at least 20 plus.
Yeah, and we're all guilty of making them. Yeah.
Right. All right. So the first mistake, and this is a mistake I see all the time, starting the book in the wrong spot.
Yeah, so let's talk about what this looks like, because there's a few ways we could tackle this. I think the number one way this manifests is starting too early, and then a lot of like backstory, world building, explanations, warming up to that, like, you know, that main part of the story. Why that's a problem is that we need to hook readers right away, right? Depending on who you talk to, we have like 10 seconds, we have 1 page, we have 3 pages. And if you're kind of building up and saying, hold on, let me give you all this history of my world, or let me tell you about my character's childhood, we're not really going to hook anybody, right? So that's one of the ways it manifests. The other way I see it manifest a lot is it's like, okay, we here start with action. So we have like car chases or any, like the most exciting thing you can imagine. And then it's like, okay, but hold on, because now I'm going to go and take you back 30 years and we're going to talk about this. If we back up and say, why does this happen? 2 reasons, right? One, we're worried. We want the reader to understand what we understand. And I think there's a little bit of a fear that's like, maybe I'm not capable of pulling this off, so I'm just going to kind of put this on the page and see what happens. And then the other thing is we take writing advice too literally sometimes. So start with action and we're like, all right, flash bang bombs, like let's do this. So yeah, I'd say those are the 2 most common ways this manifests, and just always go back to the reason why we don't want to do this or what we're trying to do in our first couple pages, and that'll get you where you need to go.
I completely agree. A lot of people, when we say like, please don't start with a giant history lesson or info dump, a lot of people will cite Tolkien, and they're like, but Tolkien, and it's like, yes, but that was a long time ago, and publishing standards have changed, and you can still love those books, and people still appreciate those books, but they go into them knowing that this is from another time, and it was different publishing standards. If you were to try and get a book published like that today, it wouldn't go so well.
Yeah, and the people who are reading that probably also have like the world building companion, right? They want to go into the history of Middle Earth and all that. So it does go to like know your audience. It's so hard sometimes too to know where is that right place to start until you get to the end. So I see a lot of writers get stuck here where they're like, well, let me just, okay, you don't like that opening, let me redo it 20 times. We're all guilty. I've been there too. But you know, sometimes if you get to the end of your story and you're like, okay, this is what it's about, this is what my theme is, this is what my character arc is, then you can say, okay, well, obviously it makes the most sense to start here versus, you know, with 10 pages of backstory.
I'm constantly telling people that because a lot of people just want to rewrite the first chapter over and over again. And I always say your first chapter is always going to be the worst when it comes to the self-editing phase. Totally. So just let it stink. Just let it sit there and fester. Yeah. Finish the draft, and then you can go back and fix it. And by the time you're at that phase, you will be a better, more competent writer, and you can fix it as a better writer and not as a novice who's just doing the same chapter over and over again.
And I actually think there's something to like skipping that in its entirety. Just don't even write the first chapter, start with chapter 2 and say, I will deal with that later. I'll know more. I'll know the right place. The advice we always see for where is the right spot is what's the latest possible point that we can start. And I even tell people like, okay, let's pretend it's that, and then maybe chop off like the 2 scenes you were planning after that, and you're probably at the right spot. So it's like, what is the day that things change, that the conflict kicks into gear, even if your character doesn't know, because most of them aren't going to know. You have characters like Katniss, right, who she does know that the day of the reaping is a big deal, but she doesn't know that her sister's name will get chosen. So it's like, that's a great example of starting the latest we can possibly start. So you, the writer, have to know it's like we're dropping them in this moment right before the conflict shows up, even if they don't know it.
I think another thing that gets a lot of people messed up is usually people talk about the start of the book is usually a glimpse at their normal life right before it becomes not normal. And a lot of people are like, okay, so they're going to wake up and they're going to go to school. They're going to go to the first period, second period, and they're going to take them through the whole day. It's like, no, a glimpse, like a glimpse at their normal day could be, instead of you showing the whole day at school, it could be them in their last class counting the seconds until the bell rings. And so their normal life is you see for a couple paragraphs, they're a student. Like we don't need the full monotonous day, you know?
And that goes back to taking advice too literally, right? It's like, yes, we have great intentions, but we don't literally mean set up every single thing about their normal world. And I think this is where plotting methods get us into a little bit of trouble, because it's like they're labeled things like setup, and so we're like, okay, we're going to set up their entire world, the entire story. We always want to be thinking in terms of like working scenes as well. So setting up still requires conflict and action and like agency going on in these scenes. It's not just like setting up a day at school, like you said, and we're going through the motions and nothing's really happening, or it's like conflict that doesn't matter. So just some things to keep in mind.
I couldn't agree more. And again, like I said, this is probably the mistake that I see the most. And back when I used to do critiques for my patrons on Patreon, so many times I would be like, okay, this looks great. Delete the first 3 chapters.
Yeah.
And then you're good, because it's just day in the life. We don't need that.
For those of us who are listening and you're like, okay, I do struggle with beginnings, just write something and get it out of there. And then again, you'll get to the end and you'll say, yeah, chapters 1, chapters 2 definitely are like set up. They don't make sense, whatever. But I have a really great chapter 3, and that's where I'm going to start. So the first draft, doesn't matter, but eventually we'll need to get it to the right spot.
You just need to finish it. So I totally agree. So the next mistake is one a lot of writers don't even notice they've made until it's possibly too late to fix. And that's a lack of clarity on the story's genre.
Yeah, and this is a whole can of worms. There's so many ways we could talk about this. So the one I see the most common when I used to edit a lot of manuscripts. I don't do a lot of one-on-one work these days, but back in the day, I would see things that maybe started out and they feel like we're going to be reading a thriller. Then after the middle of the story, it starts to really be about the character's relationship. And then by the end, we're going to that happily ever after. And we're kind of like, but wait, wasn't there a bad guy out there? And like, why aren't we bringing him to justice? And so, you have to know, what is your genre? Because we need to know what is that through line, right? We're not going to, yes, we can deliver thriller and romance in the same book, but we have to know what is that through line. If there's a bad guy that's intent on world destruction, we need to resolve that central story thread by the end while delivering the romance, if that's our plan. So that's like one of the ways I see it. I'll pause so you can chime in there because I have a few other things to say.
You're going to hear me say this a lot, but I totally agree. I think people at the very least need to have a general idea of what their genre is, maybe not the subgenre. Like, for example, when I started The Savior's Champion, I knew it was going to be a fantasy romance. And by the time I finished the first draft, I was like, oh, this is a dark fantasy romance, because it ended up being darker than I expected. Yeah. But if you go in and you're like, I don't know, I'm just going to write what I want. And then you get to the end and you're like, okay, I see a lot of people who will message me and be like, it's a horror, mystery, romance, erotica with like cyberpunk. I'm like,
right.
You gotta narrow that down to like 2, like that's not going to work. So I think you at the very least need to have a general understanding of the genre, because then you need to understand its rules and then fit into them. But continue.
Right. Yeah, and I think the word I would say to describe what you just said is like, what's your intention? What are you trying to make it? Even if maybe you didn't have the most clear picture when you started, what is your intention? What is that like key story you're telling? You can look to your theme. You can look to like the books you love to read for ideas there. But that's one silo we could talk about. The other one is age range, which is a little bit less, I'd say we make this mistake the least often because we know we are writing for middle grade or we know we're writing for young adult or whatever. But then there are mistakes within that bucket. Like if you're writing for middle grade, the protagonist needs to be a middle grade protagonist, right? And this is not necessarily a rule that you can't do, but I've seen a lot of drafts written with an adult protagonist that are for middle grade, and it's like, how are our middle grade readers going to latch onto that character? And then there's kind of a third silo, which is if you are writing the cyberpunk story or the fantasy story or the sci-fi, whatever, we need to see a thread of that in the opening, because if we don't know that there's magic in the story until page 45, that's a problem, right? Because it's not setting up the reader's expectations appropriately. And I see that mistake made a lot too.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Hello, Butters.
Look at that.
She's like, yes, mistakes are being made. And actually, the age range one is probably the one that I get the most questions about, like from other people. So even though I never thought it was a common mistake, but I get so many questions where people would be like, okay, my main character is 14, but some of the characters die. Does that mean it's an adult book? And I'm like, have you heard of the Hunger Games?
Yeah.
Like people can die in young adult books. It's fine. Just look at the different categories and what can and cannot work. For example, there's, especially in romance, a lot of people want to write young adult books, but they want to make it really spicy and smutty. And we're like, hey, I call them emotional sex scenes, which is basically where we don't get any descriptions of private parts. It's just we explored each other's bodies and we connected on a deeper level, and it's just all metaphor, you know?
Right.
You can do that in a young adult book, but you know, you can't be writing full on hardcore smut. And if you want to write that, it's like your character's 18, just age them up to 19 or 20. Right. And there you go. It's not that hard, you know, but just go ahead and research and see what the different qualifiers are.
Yeah. And I think too, like sometimes we make it harder than it is. Like we're stuck between like, should they be 18? Should they be 19? And it's like, for you, does that really matter? If they can age up to 19 and you can write the book that you want, then just age them up to 19, you know? Below this discussion of genre, it's like, you have to know what it is to deliver the reader's experience. And then what is that experience per genre? And then there's like mistakes within those buckets.
Exactly. And I think it's just a matter of, let me think of a tactful way to say that. Sometimes, you know, I'll see questions where they're like, you know, my book takes place in a fantastical world with like unicorns, but there's no magic system. Is this still fantasy? And I'm like, Google. Yes, it's still fantasy. Like a fantasy it doesn't have to have magic. It could either take place in a fantastical world or it could have magic or both. And it's like, it's like you said, people overthink it when a simple Google search can just tell you the rules and you're like, you could see where you fit and then you can write your story accordingly.
Yeah. And decide if that's what you want to do or if you want to do something different. So, you know, the guidelines, the rules exist for a reason. It's not about constraining us. It's about helping us deliver what readers want from a book like ours.
That reminds me of the romance genre where so many newbies are like, I want to write a romance book, but I'm going to be different. I'm going to surprise readers and they're not going to fall in love at the end. They're going to die at the end. And it's like you can totally write that book. You can absolutely write it. You just can't market it as a romance because it doesn't fit the romance genre rules. You can market it as a tragedy or a drama or a love story. Like at the end of the day, you're not following the rules and you're hurting no one but yourself if you market it as a romance, because your readers are going to be mad.
Yeah. And I love that you said because they want to surprise readers, and it's like, you're going to surprise them. All right. And they're not going to be happy.
You're going to surprise them with 1-star reviews.
Yeah. So. They'll surprise you with those reviews.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So next up we have probably the most common mistake. I don't know anyone who hasn't made this mistake at some point. Scenes that don't add to the big picture story.
Yeah. And this one again has multiple layers to it. So there's kind of that, you hear that advice that's like, oh, we're all going to have to kill our darlings, right? This is kind of where I feel like this advice hits home the most, because we all have those scenes that are like, you know, we're writing fantasy and we're learning about the magical unicorns and we're petting them and it's beautiful and there's like no conflict and it doesn't really do anything, but we get to touch unicorns and who doesn't want that, right? So that's like an example of what I would say. That's like your darling scene. You can make it work. You can make there be conflict, add to your character growth, your plot growth, whatever. But on its own, just petting unicorns probably isn't going to do the trick. So it's anything like that that doesn't move the story forward. How do we move the story forward? Characters driving things forward, going after a goal or trying to avoid something. And there's conflict that relates back to your bigger picture. So kind of an example I saw about this the other day, I was doing a Q&A for some other group and this person was like, I'm writing a thriller and I have a couple scenes where it's like we kind of take a break and we go on a honeymoon. The characters go on a honeymoon. And I'm like, okay, well, does anything about your main plot happen on the honeymoon? Or like, are they getting phone calls? Like, what's going on? And they're like, well, no, it's just to deepen the relationship, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, well, how many of those scenes do you have? About 4 or 5. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, imagine the thriller reader who's reading that and they're like, can we get back to the exciting bits? The key point is like every scene has to earn its place, and usually by doing more than one thing. So it's usually not enough to just say like, well, I'm showing the world or I'm deepening character. We want to move all the threads in the story forward.
People will ask, you know, how can I tell if a scene is filler or not? Like, I think it's important because you get to know the characters. And it's like, well, you can get to know the characters while the conflict is happening. That's part of the point of the conflict, is it kind of exposes who the characters are. So I always say, if you were to delete this scene, could the story continue and not be confusing for readers? And if the answer is yes, then delete the scene. And if it's something like the unicorns, petting the unicorns, that you're really passionate about, it's possible to merge concepts or merge scenes. So maybe in another scene, maybe it's a romance and they go on a date in another scene, but they're just going on a date at an inn or a bar or a restaurant, and the setting is pretty boring. You could instead have them go on a date at a unicorn place and they're petting the unicorns on the date. So now you're moving the romantic story forward, but you're also keeping your darling, the unicorns. And that's something that I'm constantly recommending people to do, because like, I really like this scene, it has some funny lines, and I'm like, okay, well, what about this scene where you haven't figured out, you know, the details yet? Could you smush them together? And that's usually a good solution if it's a scene that you're particularly passionate about, but usually you could just delete it. I was writing tons of filler when I first got started, and then as you evolve and grow, you start to realize the places where it's like, well, I could have mixed this together. And then it just becomes second nature, where at some point in your career, you're not writing any filler because you're already putting the pieces together. I remember when I was writing The Savior's Champion, originally I have the character of the Savior, and she has 3 sisters, and she was originally going to have 4 sisters. And then I realized that one of the jobs of the 4th sister, like her role was very minimal in the book. And I'm like, well, I could just give her job to this other existing sister, and then I don't need to have an extra character. It just starts to become second nature as you get used to merging and, combining.
And I think it's probably because you've been through the pain of having to do that so much, that you're like, okay, I get it now, universe. I'm just going to avoid that by doing it up front. Speaking of that, I had a writer who was in my group program the other day, and she came to us after having an outline, and she's like, I just took one piece of advice really seriously, and that was to make sure every scene tied back to both the plot development and the character's arc. She finished her draft fast. Then she went to beta readers, and they were like, wow, this is like one of the better drafts we're seeing. And it's all because of that lens of just make sure it counts for something,
Right. Exactly.
And then also look for conflict and change. If there's nothing significant that changed, and the example I always use is like, here's what doesn't count. Your character was hungry and they ate a sandwich and now they're not hungry. That doesn't really count unless you're like writing a story about this like day in the life, and it's like, you're doing something unique. But if you're writing a romance, the change should be around the romance. If you're writing a thriller, it should be around that thriller plot. So how are you tying it back to that change? And sometimes that's not super literal either. So in a lot of like fantasy stories, there's life and death stakes, but not every scene's going to be life and death. But the gathering of information, the losing of companions or tools, all of that affects that bigger picture development. So as long as you can kind of argue what that is in each scene, you should be good to go.
Yes, I completely agree. Next up is a mistake a lot of writers overlook, and that's too much focus on the external plot and not enough attention to how the plot impacts the characters.
Yes, so this is one I wish I could like magically help us all understand, even from the very beginning of our story development. And I was giving someone an example of this yesterday, which is, I'm just going to tell you, like, here's an example of what it looks like in an outline where it's all about the external. So I'm Sarah, my character Sarah. She comes home from work. There's a letter in her mailbox. It's from Scotland, and she reads it and learns she has an inheritance. We see her book a plane ticket, and then in the next scene, she's in Scotland. And it's like, okay, cool. That might be interesting on the surface. If you asked me to describe like what does that mean to Sarah? And you ask Jenna, what does that mean to Sarah? We would both have completely different answers because you didn't tell us what that means, right? So now imagine the same scenario. And it's like, okay, Sarah comes home from work. She reads this letter that she has an inheritance. It's in Scotland. She feels really guilty because she didn't even know she had family. And how does this great aunt kept tabs on her for all these years and she never knew her? And then she feels stressed because mom never talks about the Scottish side of the family. And I have to tell mom I'm going to Scotland. So it just becomes this like deeper, more personal journey for Sarah specifically. And that specificness is what makes your story special and unique and engaging. So we always want to be bringing things back to like who our character is, what they want, why do they want it, what's their wound, what's their worldview, because if I'm this character, Sarah, I carry this weird guilt about I never knew my Scottish side of the family and mom's now upset with me because I'm going to Scotland to get to know them.
And that's the thing is, I think a lot of people forget, they'll say the concept of my book has been done before, and the external conflict of every book has been done before. Like
Totally.
the inheritance, the Scottish inheritance, I could think of a million books that have that exact same concept, or movies, that have that exact same concept. What makes a story unique is the character and their experience through it, their voice, their nuances and everything else. And so when I'm outlining a story, I usually start with outlining the external plot beats, and then I go through and think, okay, well, how does this character feel about this? My book has a lot of death. So when the character kills his first person, I'm like, how does he feel now that he's killed someone? Is he like racked with guilt, or is he surprised at how totally fine he feels about it?
Right.
It's those things that kind of separate your story from another story that may have the same external conflict, but your stories will feel totally different because they don't have the same character experiences.
Yeah, I love that. And I love your example because a lot of people will start with the external because that's what we dream about. We imagine the things like the unicorn petting scene. Can you guys tell I'm obsessed with unicorns? And I want to pet them. But yeah, so we start with the external. And then what I find is a super helpful exercise is like, let's pretend that after your character killed whoever, maybe like you don't know where to go next, but you kind of know where the midpoint of your story is. So it's like you're here and you need to go to the midpoint. So if you're stuck on how do I get them there externally, you can go into your character's head and say, well, how would they react? Like, are they going to be proud of the kill, devastated by the kill? Are they going to have lingering guilt? And then how does that start to inform what they're going to do next? A lot of people discount like how much power that can have in their outlining and in their drafting process. And when you discount it, that leads to the mistake we just talked about, which is where scenes don't connect to the bigger story.
I mean, it's important for any type of book, but I think it's especially important for series, because if you're writing a series and the characters are traveling from book to book to book, it's going to be very weird. Well, first of all, no one's going to read the whole series if you don't have any internal conflict or any characterization, because they're going to be super bored. Yeah. But it's going to be super weird if they get to the end of the series and the character is exactly the same, unchanged by all these events that have happened in their life. I mean, there are series where like a flat arc works, but that's usually sort of like action adventure type stories where it's just like guns blazing. It's very specific genres where that works. Most genres, you need to see some type of growth and development. For my series, for example, the change in the characters, like internal conflicts and whatnot, is a huge part of the plot in The Savior's Army, because so much happened in the first two books and they were so affected by it. It's creates a bigger conflict in the next book.
Yeah.
So people will discount this, and not only is it boring to read because we don't care about the characters because we don't know anything about them, but it's going to make it so much harder to craft future books in the series if you don't really know where their head's at.
And especially because of what you just said too, like we make mistakes as people and as characters based off these outdated worldviews or misbeliefs, whatever. It's like you're knocking over dominoes. I've made a mistake based on this outdated worldview. I make 10 more, and then I finally realize maybe that's not working out for me, right? And we change. So yeah, just constantly thinking of like, how are things tying back to your character and your plot? You'll get so much further than not considering those things.
Lastly, I was excited to talk about this because I think this is a mistake that isn't discussed enough. Lack of clarity on the main theme or takeaway of the novel.
Yeah. And this is another thing we love to overthink, because the main thing that comes up when I talk to writers about theme is it's like, well, I have 18 themes. And it's like, okay, sure, you can talk about multiple things in your story, right? But what is the one thing that reigns supreme? And you have to think again about, why is this important? Well, if you're writing a romance and love conquers all, which is mainly the theme of like every romance novel, right? The all piece will be different. It could be love conquers societal class issues. It could be love conquers past hurts or whatever it is, right? But love wins. If you're not writing to show that through your plot and how your characters grow, then can you imagine the kind of messy draft you're going to come up with, right? If a couple scenes are kind of not adding or subtracting to that theme, what are they doing? If by the end we don't express that, what are we doing, right? So it's really helpful. I even love putting it on like a sticky note. What is my main theme? If you don't know, it can be a very generic thing too as well. Like fantasy, are you playing in the realm of survival? Probably, because you have life and death stakes. So like, what does it take to survive? Does it involve magic, And it could be as simple as friendship equals survival, or trusting others equals survival, right? Like, what is the cause and effect? And then how is your story going to show it? And if you don't have that, it's not going to emotionally resonate with people.
What I like to say to people is, what is the point? Like, what is the point of your book? And I think also focusing on that is a great way to a great way to eliminate filler, because it's like, focus on the point. What are you trying to say? And if you start veering into other directions, I mean, there were scenes that I have wanted to write before where I was like, oh, this would be so cute and it would be so fun. And I'm like, but it's not the point. It's not the point. And so I think, well, maybe one day I'll, release fun little short stories for people who want side adventures, but it doesn't belong in the book because it doesn't follow the point. And as writers, we're so creative when we get all these ideas, and it's like, that's great, but the reader doesn't care.
And I think too, like a lot of the things we've been talking about today, it's like, this is kind of that, like the craft piece of it, right? We can have all the ideas. We're very creative people. We love coming up with ideas for books and characters and scenes, whatever. But the craft and the discipline of it is knowing, what is that filter? How are you going to like trim all these things and give us one impactful adventure or experience? And I bet for listeners, if you're kind of like, I don't know about this one, think about the last great book you've read and like, what was the point of that? And I bet if you think about it longer, you'll be like, okay, it was all adding up to that one point.
And that's the thing. It's like the theme doesn't, like, a lot of people overthink it. And like you said, 18 different themes, and they'll be like super, deep. And I'm trying to, mirror societal, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it doesn't have to be that deep. And sometimes focusing on like the general picture is a good idea. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any projects in the works, and where can everyone find you online?
I think the best place to find me is my podcast. So that's just called Fiction Writing Made Easy, and it's available on every podcast player. You can go to my website at savannahgilbo.com. And are we able to give away a free gift, Jenna?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I have a free gift for anyone who's just starting out and you're like, I really want to avoid these mistakes. It sounds easy, but in practice, it's not. Not as straightforward. It's called your First Draft Roadmap, 10 Steps to Writing a Novel, and it'll help you avoid some of these mistakes. So you can grab that at savannahgilbo.com/write.
Awesome. That is so exciting. Everyone, I will have the link in the description. Definitely check it out.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Oh my gosh, Butters. She's like,
I love her little face.
I know. She's like, thank you for showing up. Please.
Yes, my boy.
Hello. Oh my gosh, Butters, look. It's a friend. Oh, so that's all I got for you today. Butters, you look like a hot dog. How to Write Romantasy comes out in October, so if you're trying to write your very own fantasy romance novel, pre-order it today. It's linked below. You can also check out my first writing craft book, Shut Up and Write the Book, or you can check out the first 2 books in my award-winning romantasy series, The Savior's Champion and The Savior's Sister. They're linked below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I post new videos on Wednesdays, and I host live streams on Mondays, and if you want to be alerted as soon as I upload, ring that bell. Say bye. Have you subscribed to my channel yet? I mean, you totally should. I post new videos on Wednesdays. I also host live streams on Mondays, and they're super fun. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel and be sure to ring that bell. That way you're alerted as soon as I post new content.